Good afternoon. I'm going to just have to do a sound check because my computer was mysteriously silent just as I logged on. Can you, people who are online, can you confirm if you can actually hear anything? Sounds good. It would have been difficult for you to answer this question unless you had heard me, right? So, great. Okay, good. I'm glad. Okay. Well, welcome back. And I think what's been a couple of weeks, huh? So I'm very happy to be back on track here with our study. And so we're presently studying a work which I was really encouraged to find out about. And it's called the Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness. And I'll tell you why I think it's so great, because in Buddhism you come across a lot of insights. You know, the Buddhist teaching is never ever designed to just make you feel good. I'm sorry to say that. But it is designed in getting to the root of suffering. And just like if we go to the doctor, we're not exactly expecting that the doctor is just going to pat us on the back and saying, you're basically good. We probably might have to go through some process. And that can range from taking bitter tinctures to operations to all sorts of things. And so the Buddhist teaching is intended to get to the bottom of suffering. Now, the good news about this is, like we very often say, the path is good in the beginning, the middle, and the end. But it doesn't necessarily correspond to the way that we ordinarily think about things. And that's where the Buddhist teaching, it doesn't necessarily just come with a bunch of predictable adages that in which we're just told to just relax, or we're, you know, just have faith or anything. We're actually given work. And that's where the present text is really good, because there's so many of the teachings and the theory that we're exposed to in the Buddhist teaching that sometimes they're sort of, we have them here, we have them there. And it's this particular text really outlines the various views we have on reality in the Buddhist teaching. And sometimes these different traditions, they appear to say different things. And you can also see in the practice of the various Buddhist traditions, the different traditions, they go about the way that they engage in the path very differently. So that's where it's good to have a little bit of an overview and understand, where is everybody coming from? Now, everybody is coming from an insight into a greater perspective. And this is what in the Buddhist teaching is referred to as vipassana or wisdom and so on. And these teachings, like I say, they're not necessarily easily digestible. Just recently, a friend of mine, I was going over a text by a friend of mine about mindfulness and the way that mindfulness is marketed in and appropriated within the contemporary context of psychology. And their mindfulness is essentially put to the service of making people feel good. And that's not necessarily what we do in Buddhism. We're not particularly about feeling good at all. But we are, like I was just saying, we are very interested in getting to the bottom of things. And getting to the bottom of things really comes with, you could say, a gospel, if you like, that we're basically good. But to continue with the status quo of just pursuing a rather unimaginative and rather vague understanding of reality is not going to be particularly helpful. And that's where the teachings that we have in the Buddhist teaching, they are provocative. And my friend was making this point that when we hook up mindfulness with the sort of a culture of psychologization or neurologization, and try to essentially have mindfulness serve the purpose of us finding ease, finding peace of mind, and essentially also working with our brains, that the circuits are functioning optimally. And of course, there's a lot of peer-reviewed papers that will verify that there's a lot of benefits of that kind. And for that reason, then mindfulness is endorsed as a therapeutic modality. But in fact, in the Buddhist teaching, mindfulness is really just about us beginning to connect with reality and beginning to make friends with reality and essentially beginning to embrace reality rather than perpetuating a cocoon in which we could possibly feel all right for some time. And that, of course, always then results in sometimes we're content because we're happy, and then we're not content when we're not happy. And in that way, mindfulness hooked up and becoming the vehicle for the project of just feeling good is a very limited approach to what we really mean with mindfulness, and particularly, of course, what is in the Buddhist, where mindfulness really serves in the Buddhist teaching, is to essentially provide a vehicle and a structure for having vipassana, insight into reality. Now, like I said, the good news is that the Buddha found out our reality is basically good. And that already is a big departure from a lot of what we have in the sort of modern and postmodern worldview, which is very often the sort of the notion of the selfish gene, and everybody's in it for themselves. And there's not really much meaning within this directionless, random universe, etc. So that's where the Buddhist teaching comes with an enormously important insight, which is basically that our disposition is innately pure, innately good. But at the same time, we're going to have to actually begin to connect with reality in order to discover that. And that's where sitting down on our bottom and actually being properly present, and that's where the method of coming back to the breath is very helpful, and coming back to anything that really connects us with actually beginning to feel and beginning to be here is immensely important. And that is essentially what we're doing with meditation. But this is particularly my point here then, that we engaging in particularly then in the Buddhist path and the notion of enlightenment really comes with a radically, or you could say a radical insight, which is the insight into the fact that phenomena cannot be held, phenomena cannot be grasped. And that goes both for the phenomenal world, the objective world that we have outside, and it also goes for our own psychological dimension, our subjective being, our first person subjective experience. And that's where the Buddhists, they begin to say things that, you know, people come to Buddhism and it sounds very lovely. There's sort of promises of becoming like the Dalai Lama and becoming a peaceful, loving, compassionate person. And that's all very good, you know, and you kind of tag along with that, and they're very rational, and they're not sort of trying to sell you any kind of weird stuff, metaphysical stuff about this, that, or the other. And it's very verifiable. But then they begin to talk about things that extend beyond what we have already established as acceptable, rational worldview. And that's where you could say it's all very good, but they say some odd things. And the whole idea in the Buddhist teaching of enlightenment is totally radical from an ordinary modern materialist view, in which, you know, there's you and your brain, and that's kind of it. You're not expected to really be much more than just a sort of a reactive circuit of neurobiological systems. And so on. And that's where, you know, you're just here for a short time and just make the most out of it. That's where the insight into enlightenment is actually the insight into the purity and the complete lack of neurosis, the complete lack of self-centering, and a complete awakening of the subjective dimension. And that is something that is basically not part of the worldview for most persons, unless you sort of believe in then metaphysical phenomena and so on, but it's never really, you could say, presented in a rational way. And that's where the Buddhist teaching and what we're looking at here, it actually goes into the rational processes of looking at our assumptions around reality and what it is that limits us. And that is where we again and again come back to this rather unavoidable fact that we are self-centered creatures. But the difference between the Buddhist view and, you say, the views such as the idea of the selfish gene and so on, is that self in the Buddhist teaching is essentially seen as a delusional condition. It is not seen as a given. And so self is not really some sort of something that's there undeniably as part of our makeup. It's definitely part of the way that we work, it's the way that we function, but it's also that which is the cause of suffering. And that's where we, on a very intuitive level, can see the more we sort of get caught up in self-centering, proportionately there's suffering. The more there's selflessness, and we're not talking about some sort of unhealthy martyr approach to selflessness, but really just the, you could say, the lightness and the freedom of selflessness, there's proportionate lack of suffering. And so there's a very intuitive approach to this, but then also, and what we're going to look at here is there's also a very rational way in which we can actually identify this lack of self. And that, of course, is then the foundation for the entire project of Vipassana. Now, the different traditions of Vipassana, you have it in the Theravadan tradition, you have in the various Mahayana tradition, you have in the Vajrayana tradition, the various ways to approach this selflessness is very different. And while there are some common parameters, there's also some interesting differences. So this is what this book essentially is about. And I guess because it's been a couple of weeks since we last were doing this study, I felt compelled to come up with as I always do, sort of using 25% of the time just to the introduction. So you'll have to pardon me again for doing that. But I think it's an important point. And just to reiterate then where we've gotten to in the book, which is very much looking at the way that we begin to approach the path in terms of insight, very much on the basis of first the theory, and then on the basis of the theory actually questioning and challenging and thinking critically about the information that we receive. And only on the basis of that do we then engage in meditation. So last time then we've looked at how we can analyze this self. And the thing is, if we look at the self, we never find anything that's unchanging. So we never find anything that is unitary. There's never something within our psychology that constitutes an unchanging self. We simply cannot find it. We definitely operate, and that was Khenpo's point last time, we operate with a vague sense of I exist. But actually, if we look where that I exist actually sits, we cannot find anything. And that's where we can initially have an appreciation of this intellectually. And that's why we need to actually go through this critical thinking, questioning, and so on with regards to this no self. But having done that, and this of course is where it's probably imperative that we read what the Khenpo has said thus far, but he then makes a very important point, because he says understanding this intellectually is not enough. And there has to be a place where we ponder this and we actually arrive at certainty. So just like we might be worried about something. You know, we might be worried that we forgot to lock the front door. So it's nighttime and we're living in the city, and we got to bed, and then we might say, oh, I did lock the door. You know, honey, did you lock the door? I think so. And then well, could you please go down and check it? Because otherwise there's no certainty, right? So you go down and you find out either the door is locked or it's not, but you at least have certainty. So that's where there has to be a place where, with regards to this issue, that we actually have some certainty. Now, once we have that, then all of a sudden meditation then begins to take on a different role. And that is where meditation then is beginning to understand the logic of not perpetuating these self-centered narratives, and you could say narratives in general, and beginning to actually connect with our reality beyond just our constant regurgitation of familiar narratives. And that's where meditation then becomes very, very important. What is particular for Vipassana then is that we have two approaches. One is an analytical approach to Vipassana, which is based on analysis, logical analysis, and then also then what we call settling meditation, which is more what we, for example, do here when we meditate, which is just settling and connecting to being present beyond the arising of thoughts. So that's where settling meditation enables us to connect beyond the conceptual. But with Vipassana, initially, it is essential that there is this, you could say, rational, conceptual approach, really, in order for us to gain this thing that we call certainty. So we left off last time here, a little bit into this section here called method of investigation. So the Khenpo says, instinctively, we identify ourselves with our bodies and minds. We have a very strong emotional attachment to them, even though our whole idea of self and mind is very vague and confused. For example, when we're sick, we sometimes say, I am sick. And yet, in the very next breath, we may say, because I have a headache. This is interesting. So what do we mean? This is where we got to last time. Do we mean I is one thing and the head is another? Because we just say, I am sick. But it's actually not I who is sick, because then we're saying, I have a headache. So that's the pain is obviously in the head, right? And so we could say, who then is this I? Is this I the head, or what? Why do we say I am sick instead of just saying my brain is, or my head is aching? But we fall back to this identification with it, which is we say I am sick. Now, this is a really good example, because this is the kind of thing that hopefully if you hear this, you're kind of a bit annoyed. And it's kind of like, this is totally counters to the grain of how I ordinarily think. So hopefully it's provocative. So anyway, he says, do we mean I is one thing and the head another? Or do we mean that the head is the I? One should begin one's investigation with these very common sense notions of I, and I the doer, or I the experiencer. So he goes on to say, one could think, for example, of having one's limbs and organs removed or transplanted. If one were given another man's heart, would it really affect the I? We naturally think that I, the experiencer doer, has now received a new heart. One does not think that one is grafting a new heart into the I as such. How far can one go with this process? With limbs and organs, it seems quite clear that the I is a separate entity. But what about the brain? Suppose one had another man's brain implanted into one's skull. Would that affect the I? One might find oneself wondering whether the I, experiencer, doer, could actually use another man's brain and yet still be the same person. One might wonder if one might find some actions governed by the I one has now, and some actions governed by the I of the person from whom the brain was taken. Of course, one cannot know what the result of such a transplant would be, were it ever possible to perform it. But instinctively, one feels it is important to know whether the I would be affected or not. And I think I mentioned last time I was looking for a Danish friend of mine. Yeah. Okay, well, in Denmark, most of us high school kids, we had to read this piece called The Patient, Peter Seeberg, Patienten. And in there, it's about a man who has all his parts replaced. You know, first they take off, you know, his arms, and they have some things they can replace it with, and then eventually, you know, the torso eventually was replaced. Finally, his head was replaced. And this was written in the 1960s. It's a beautiful thing. And of course, the man has a little bit of an identity crisis at that point. You know, who am I actually? I thought it was a hilarious piece. And I always come back to this when we actually talk about this discussion about whether or not, you know, the I is identical or the sum of its parts. Because of course, the doctors and the man's wife, they reassure him that he's still the same. But of course, The wife is looking at a person whose body has been completely replaced. But it is interesting, and why it's interesting is because we actually, if we visualize this or imagine this, we would actually think, yes, it's still me. You know, I'd have my head replaced, I had my heart replaced, everything replaced. I'd still impute me and associate identity with that, right? So this is interesting. So anyway, so although this seems so important, we're still very unclear about this, what this I might be. We may wonder if it is perhaps just a small vital part of the brain. However, when one thinks about it, one is not emotionally attached to a minute mechanism in one's gray matter, right? So there we are. I'm my brain, right? That's there was also a great movie some years ago called The City of the Lost Children. Did you ever see that? A Belgian movie? And it's basically about this this racket that's run by a criminal brain, but the brain just sits in a vat. So the main character behind the mastermind behind this is this brain that sits in a vat. Anyway, if that were all one's emotional, if that were all one's emotional attachment were about, it would be easy enough to remove and all the suffering with it, right? We just have a little bit of a sort of a nice convenient lobotomy, and that would be the end of suffering. Life would not need to have any meaning, nor human life any particular value. There would be no need to go on struggling in a life full of suffering and frustration. However, such a view strikes us as totally nihilistic and demeaning. The I feels it is more important than that. So we are generally, you know, prone to think that we're a bit more than just the brain. We're a bit more than just sort of a motherboard, a computer, whatever, you know. So Khenpo says, the I that we are emotionally attached to seems to step back and look on life, evaluating, experiencing, and wishing to avoid suffering. We do not experience it or treat it the way we would a physical object like a brain. We know from general knowledge gleaned from other people that the brain is in the skull. It can be physically located, touched, and measured. It has some relationship with the mind because when our mental state changes, a change can often be detected in the brain. However, whatever scientists may find out about the brain, they will only be able to tell us the relationship between mind and brain in more detail. So this is neural correlation, which is, of course, then what in neuroscience, there was, again, David Chalmers from ANU, he famously coined the soft problems. So you have neuroscience that deals with what he then called the soft problems. But the hard problem still remains. What is consciousness? And this is where he actually brought, you could say, neuroscience to the humble recognition that actually consciousness has not properly been understood. All we're doing in neuroscience is essentially dealing with neural correlations and interesting aspects that all can be sort of labeled the soft problems. So, so the Khenpo says they can look, probe, and measure to find facts about what the brain is doing, but how will they know what the mind is experiencing as they do it? They may, for example, be able to say there's a lot of activity in such and such region of the brain when a person thinks of red. But how do they know the person is really experiencing red? The person himself knows for sure the nature of his experience. He may call it red, he may not. He may not call it anything. He will never know if anyone else ever experiences anything in the way that he does, even if everyone agrees to call the experience they have by the same name. So this is so interesting because, in fact, all the findings that you have when it comes to the mappings of the brain according to neuroscience and neural correlation and so on, it all depends at the end of the day that you have a subject that says, this is what I was thinking about. You need to have somebody who's actually experiencing something. So you can maybe measure that there's various patterns and signals that are going off in the brain, but you have to have a subject that's there to say, I was perceiving this, I was thinking of that. Without that, you cannot make anything. You can have so much data about what's happening in the brain, but that doesn't actually help at all. So this is an interesting argument that very much takes place within neuroscience, and between the camp that you call the limitivists, which would say there is no such a thing as consciousness. There's only just, there's neural pathways, there's firing of neurons, there's chemical processes, and so on. And of course, those who would say, wait a minute, we have something we call experience. And then we sort of scratch our head and go, how are we going to account for that when science exclusively deals with what is material? So these are some interesting discussions that last time I was alluding to the fact that if Peter was here, we could actually have some interesting sort of input from authoritative quarters, from the scientific community. Anyway, we'll do that sometime. So the Khenpo, and once again, let me point out the Khenpo is extraordinary because we're talking about a man who was, when he came to the West and started teaching, he was maybe in his mid-50s or something. Somebody who already had gone through a whole life as a yogi in Tibet. In the middle of his life, he then really took an education and became a very accomplished Khenpo. And then teaching essentially what has been the property of Tibetan Buddhism for some 1,200 years and Buddhism for 2,500 years, all his life, comes to the West, and there's a completely different paradigm. And where very often you have this situation that, Tibetan monks or teachers come to the West, and they kind of just hang out and they sort of have a good time with the students, and everybody loves the Tibetan monks and lamas and so on, because they're very, very affable and lovely people. So there's always good vibrations. But it's rare actually that you have somebody who actually sits down and properly hashes out the real hard problems that faces us in view of there's two different cultures that meet, and they have a very different way of understanding this thing. So this Khenpo is very, very special, really, in having engaged in conversations with his students to the extent that he has. Of course, this work we have here might have been heavily edited, but still this really reflects the Khenpo going into this research and going into this conversation. So he says, who can know how anything is experienced other than the experiencer? The scientists can say that the brain is acting as if it were experiencing red because the brain is doing what it always does when people are experiencing red. Who will know if they are right in any particular case or not? Only the experiencer can know for sure. The scientist relies on well-informed guesswork. Certain theories are taken to be true because they seem to explain events very well. So that's where we have a lot of explanations, but at the end of the day, all depending on the first person. See here. Indigenous traditions and cultures acknowledge the presence of our spirit or soul, which isn't located physically but felt usually in the heart. We may not be able to find our eye, but we feel it. If externalists say that the eyes are the window of the soul, what would a Buddhist say, seeing as they don't believe in souls? What is it that we see in others, humans, animals, if it is a soul or an eye? Well, that is what first of all, what we're experiencing, we are experiencing with, like we looked in the Abhidharma and we looked at how we have a subject, or rather we have an object, and then we have a faculty that we perceive, that we have in terms of our senses, and then we have consciousness that's generated that says my experience of red, my experience of the other person. But that's also where we can see when we, for example, see something in others, it's very much our interpretation, and it's very much fabricated on the basis of what we're experiencing of the other is, you could say, going through the filter of the mind and consciousness. And then again, that is where then this consciousness that is experiencing, is it really experiencing the object? Is it really experiencing the other? Or is it entangled in a lot of subjective material? And that's, of course, what we're looking at here, because we need to acknowledge, and that's really where the Buddhist science has its particular view on what is reality, is entirely dependent on whether or not the subject is connected with reality. So it's not so much that there's an objective reality out there. There's very much a question of, are we actually experiencing reality? And it's only on the basis of beginning to eliminate the confusion that's particular to the subject, that there actually is a beginning and a seeing of reality without the overlay of our particular likes and dislikes, agendas, biases, confusions of various kinds. So of course, everything that's being done here is very much continually operating with this subjective dimension that in cultures, traditions, religions, and so on is referred to as the soul. And the Buddhists are not saying that there's not consciousness, but they're saying this so-called soul is not something eternal or unchanging. It's something that is continually, you could say, a construction. It's constructed in the context of context, constructed in terms of our psychological material, etc. So that's where you could say the Buddhist teaching very much, the center of it is looking at this particular dimension of our subjective experience. So Khenpo continues, the main thrust of Buddhism, however, is not about theories at all. It is about experience. In particular, it is concerned with the experience of suffering. So that's where, at the end of the day, as much as there might be a lot of, you could say, provocative thoughts that arise in the context of Buddhist studies, at the end of the day, we need to be quite clear what is the objective. The objective is just like if you're studying medicine, it's to be able to alleviate suffering. But we also operate very much with not just the suffering being something that we externalize and pathologize in one way or another, but it has to do with us actually working first with our own confusion. So that's where there's a humble recognition that we have personal confusion, that is then what's the basis for suffering. So that's what the Buddha's teaching is about, and that's also where the Buddha was coming from. Not to make some interesting philosophical statements, but really to address the issue of the universal issue of suffering. So the Khenpo then says, what Buddhism has discovered is that the experience of suffering is always associated with strong emotional attachment to a vague sense of self. So Buddhism turns its attention onto that strong emotional response associated with that sense of self and asks how that self is actually experienced. Where is that I experienced? So that's where so we are definitely acknowledging the experience of self, but then we are also looking at the strength of the emotions that come with that, the whole package. So then and this is of course where we're then talking about neurologizing and neurologization, because then we have again coming back to the notion of the brain, right? The idea of cognitive science, that it's all the brain. So, or the heart, but also then even when we talk about the heart, because very often there's actually research that associates the experiences of emotionality a lot with firing of neurons in the heart region as well. So it's not just the brain, but either way, we're talking about something that is entirely physical. So the Khenpo says one might answer that one experiences it in the brain. However, one does not need to know anything about the brain in order to suffer. Even a dog or a child suffers. They do not have theories about the self, but their behavior suggests that they are attached to a sense of self. If they were not, why would a child or dog existing in one instant of time concern itself about a dog or a child that was going to exist in the next moment? This is where we actually have, interestingly, there's not this continuity is actually not, this is of course also we looked at in the Abhidharma, but actually we have continual singular moments from one to the next, but they don't exist as some sort of like unchanging stream. So this is again a very provocative, but again, on the basis of our observation, we can see that we're not the same person. Even we can see this over time, but we could also see it in every micro moment. So the Khenpo says, surely it's because unconsciously he is thinking that the dog or the child of the next moment is still him in some sense and is distinct from anyone else. When he sees a threat to his life or comfort, he recoils from it. Unconsciously, he is thinking that he could escape this threat and continue his existence somewhere more pleasant. This shows that he has a sense of an independent existence. So that's also where we could say, if we were just nothing more than just a motherboard or sort of a chemicals, then why would there be any concern whatsoever? It's not as if your computer is going to go into a deep existential crisis if you decide to chuck it out, right? So that's where this is also a Tantra conservative. He's sort of he's saying the whole idea and the discussion around artificial intelligence, this will be such an important, you could say, discussion for modern science to begin to identify individuality beyond just thinking of the individual as something that just exists as, you could say, a computer, or something that is just exists in terms of data or information. So Khenpo says one could argue that in lower forms of living organisms, recoiling from unpleasant stimuli is simply a mechanical response, like trees waving in the wind. Maybe this is true for primitive forms of life, but this does not have any bearing on the problems of suffering at all. If we were merely complex mechanical devices, one could argue that objectively suffering did not matter. So, like we were just saying, this would be an extremely impoverished attitude to life and not a very convincing one. This is also interesting because that actually plays into the whole sort of the existentialist attitude, which is very much like you are nothing more than that. And so the height of your existence is really your passions, your emotions. And even if you're a suffering individual, at least, you know, Matthew Ricard, he makes this point in his book about happiness, which is in France, you know, the intellectual sort of milieu there, they basically abhor the idea of being a happy person. That would be a complete sort of like bland, sad state of mind. If you're a happy individual, who would want that? You know, the real sort of your sort of whole value of your existence is tied up in the whole drama around your pain. You know, so you know, it's like I'm often joking that you'd never want Bob Dylan to be happy because he churned out so much great, you know, music and poetry. But at the same time, this is nevertheless what comes down to a very bleak, I'll say this on my own expense, a very bleak view that you have, particularly in the sort of the postmodern view, that in fact there is nothing in our existence. There is nothing there. And so the only thing you really have is just the value that you can bring to your own particular drama. And that is, even if we might sort of dress it up in all sorts of glamour and saying all the progress humanity has made and all this sort of amazing technologies, it's fundamentally a very bleak place in which an individual actually has no real, you could say, value. And so it is a profoundly impoverished attitude to life. And of course, it runs completely against our immediate experience, which is my existence is important. So to be told and brought up with a sort of dogma that you are no more than just a set of neurons firing is completely counter to the immediate experience. But it perpetrates a very dogmatic discourse of meaninglessness. So this is why we could justifiably say we protest. Anyway, so the Khenpo says one may feel that what one really means when one says that suffering is experienced in the brain is that it is experienced in the mind. So that's why, okay, fine, semantics, that's okay. We can say, oh yes, it's in the brain. Since in modern Western society, one automatically assumes that the mind is in the brain. And since one's notion of mind is so vague anyway, there does not seem to be much difference between talking about the mind and talking about the brain. However, they cannot be synonymous, even if ultimately they're discovered to be of the same stuff or nature. This is so interesting, right? This is essentially how we think of it. So he says, one cannot avoid the question of what we mean by mind. We're extremely vague and imprecise in our everyday common sense way of talking about it. Sometimes it seems we identify ourselves with our mind, as for example, when we say we are happy or sad. Although we mean the mind is happy or sad, we do not really make a distinction between ourself and our mind. Nevertheless, we also find ourselves saying things like, I could not control my mind. Incidentally, we also say, I could not control myself, as if one had two selves. This seems to be the same lack of clarity that enables us sometimes to talk as if the self were the mind, and sometimes as if the self owned the mind. So this is food for thought. I would say, please don't jump at this and saying rubbish or no or whatever. I would say this is the kind of stuff that you gotta take it with you and just let it fester. And actually, we need to sort of like test it in terms of our own experience. You know, I am happy. You know, is it really that I am happy? Is that happiness what I am? Because then it doesn't make sense that then a few minutes later I say I'm sad. I've just said I am happy, and now I say I'm sad. Okay, we say I have happiness, but then again, if that is I here and happiness there, then what's the problem? You know, or I have sadness, then it's fine. I have, you know, I might have how do you say, a flat tire, or I might have something that's sitting around that's not particularly useful, but that doesn't necessarily affect the I. So there is this continual sense, and this is really the problem, where we're identifying with what in fact are objects. And that's where we have the five skandhas, and we then say I on the basis of that. So this, I would say, please think about this. And this should hopefully, just like Aryadeva, he says, it's a bit like if you take a cloth and you dip it in acid. If you take the cloth out again, it looks like the cloth is still there. But all you need to do is go, and then it comes apart. And that is where, when we begin to think like this, it's where we begin to question. So this is where we need to question ourselves. It's not that we should write to the Khenpo and say, hey, what do you mean? Or ask me. But rather we should think about it. We should take this, and when it says something like he just says here, this is really good, yeah? Where we say, I could not control my mind. That's very interesting, because then we're saying I and the mind are two different things. So this is not something that we just right away get the answer to and go, oh, there you go. It's actually something that has to sit and annoy us, and actually should be a priority of annoying us. But nevertheless, Michela, go ahead.
Khenpo suggesting we just drop the thing I. So I just say tire flat, as opposed to it's not Jack's tire is flat, and not using the I to identify. I just.
Yeah, his point is to get to the bottom of suffering.
Sort of like dropping the I in myself.
Yeah. Yes. So is it a question of dropping the I? It's like one of my friends, he changed his email to merely labeled and then his name @gmail, you know, merely labeled Jakob. And of course that doesn't help at all, but it's for us to begin to see through this drama, you could say drama of me, where we magnify me into. One thing is that we have something that, like a flat tire, or we're out of money, or we're whatever it might be. Then one thing is to deal with it in a practical way, but the other thing is what we usually do when there's something happening, we have emotional reactions. And that's where we get, I like this, I don't like that. And what we actually do is we begin to narrow our reality down to what I like and what I want. And that's where we lose sight of the greater picture. And it's very often that when we get over our drama, when we get a little bit over ourselves, then we're actually able to cope much more effectively with things. So what we do when we get caught up emotionally in this self is actually we begin to retreat away from reality, and it's as if we only want a particular censored version of reality. And that's where we're not in for life. We're in for just our version of life. We diminish our reality. So what we're not talking about here is becoming insensitive persons who say it's all just, blah, It's about actually beginning to be willing to participate fully. And that's where the self is, when the self becomes a big deal, it's actually what begins to turn us into narrow individuals. And that's where we look at someone like the Dalai Lama or the sage or the Buddha or whatever, and we actually discover big persons. So that's where it's not a question of us all of a sudden becoming, cold or mechanical, but it's rather of us beginning to open up. And
the tire again.
Yeah, the tire.
Most of us, if the tire is flat, we find out the tire is flat because we're about to go somewhere and the tire is flat. So is Khenpo going tire flat? Do I have something to?
Yeah, he does.
So, okay. So, I mean, obviously, you're going to be late.
Okay.
Or you're supposed to get somewhere.
Okay.
And what's Khenpo saying? But I mean, anyone would go, bugger.
Yeah. Okay. So this is okay. Here's an analysis here's an example, right? The self comes very vividly present when we're about to go somewhere. We're late for an appointment, and then we discover that we have a flat tire. So what we normally would do is go bugger, or we might actually get rather upset. We'd go, we'd we could throw a tanty, or who did I lend the car to, or whatever. And so the question is, would the Khenpo just be completely unemotional, right? The Khenpo would probably, and you could say the Buddha or the Dalai Lama would say, okay, I got a flat tire. What do I need to do? Well, I call up my friend. I'm going to be late. Then I look for the spare, and then I change the tire or call the NRMA.
Identifying with life's against me because I'm going to be late. And I'd like to get into the
yeah. I mean, that's what we do. I mean, that is what we do, right? Yeah, life is against me. Yeah. Yes?
But if the Khenpo felt some frustration arise, then you would go, frustration.
If what? If
the flat tire
happened,
and then he felt some frustration arise, he didn't just have this practical response. He actually, some frustration.
Yeah.
Then he just also just go, some frustration.
Yeah. Well, yes. So there's a comment. Yeah. So the Khenpo would possibly feel some frustration, but then he'd be aware that he was having the frustration, and then he would let go of it. Yeah. So that's and that I think a lot of us who are sort of dabbling in Buddhism and things like that, that's probably what we would do, saying, I'm getting frustrated here. It probably is not going to be helpful. I would argue probably the Buddha, the Khenpo, and the Dalai Lama, they probably, from the very start, probably wouldn't be frustrated, and they would really just look at, okay, there's a flat tire. So there is a difference, and that's where you could say there's also a cognitive capacity, which really could say develops the moment that we're not caught up, and that is the point here, really, in where we're not caught up in the you can say the exaggeration around what we want and don't want. Yeah.
That's a really interesting point, exaggeration.
Yeah.
I mean that makes a lot of, that doesn't make a lot of sense when you see the difference sort of from simmering to boiling.
Yeah.
Well, then I can apply that I found it difficult to do before.
Sure. It's interesting that Charlie Rinpoche down in Melbourne, he used to, when he would talk about the kleshas, he would usually talk about, because we usually talk about anger, right? But he would usually say exaggerated anger or exaggerated jealousy or exaggerated, taking into account that in and of themselves, you could say these emotions, they have a raw quality that we would innately associate with intelligence. So we're not talking about, cutting, you could say, strength and the, you could say the radiance of the mind. We're not talking about cutting that out, but we are talking about when it becomes filtered through, you could say, the insecurity of ego. Because when we have that flat tire and we're late, it's like we feel our insecurity really, I'm gonna, everything's gonna come crashing down on me because I'm gonna be late or whatever, and there's this sort of a fear almost that takes place, So that's where the situation is really has so much to do with, and what the issue really we're trying to get at here is the you could say the insecurity of the ego, the way that ego embellishes. It's that part that's awake, aware. What's that? Well, that we would say is the nature of mind. And that's when nature of mind has been hijacked. It's been diminished. It's been, basically, we could say that this nature of the awake quality, it never goes away. That's in fact probably the only empirical thing that we have in our existence. That is consciousness. Everything else, questionable. Even the so-called physical reality, we could say that there's empirical evidence that there's a clock here, a watch, but actually if we break this down, we won't actually find anything that ultimately constitutes, you could say, the essence of watch. What we have is just a set of parts that exist together. But this awareness, that is something that we actually never separate from. And that is, you could say, unconditional. But there's a big difference between, you could say, the ground quality of being awake, aware, and so on, and then the way that we diminish it. And that's where we create what we call samsara, and that's where we suffer. And that's why the Buddha, he presented his teaching really as, you could say, the therapy, or to get to the bottom of what really we call Buddha nature, which is this quality that everybody possesses, that is not generating suffering. So the Buddha really just saw that sentient beings unnecessarily suffer because they are overlooking this awake quality that's innately theirs. So it feels like the mind is in the brain. Do you think that that is learned as well? No, it definitely feels like it. And of course, we definitely talk about neural correlation in terms of our functionality, or cognitive functionality that's associated with the brain, right? Yeah. To reflect about this crucial subject, it would be very useful to have access to the text. How can we acquire it? Who is the editor? Aha, okay. That's a very justified question. Let me just, we're getting towards the end, so I'll just go to page 1. There you go. Here we have it. So it's called Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness. Yeah, but by the way, I think it's probably translated into French. And it would be translated into quite a few languages because Khenpo taught in France, and he taught all over Europe. So this would have been translated in the various languages. If you're in France, then contact some of the Kaju centers there. I'm sure they would have it. Yeah, Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness. That's the problem with consciousness. Yeah, that's what we're onto here. This is our business. Yeah, consciousness are us. Yeah. We can also think that maybe finding a flat tire at the moment of leaving might happen to save our life. That's right. That's so true. Yes, there's the flat tire. We couldn't go, and if we had gone, maybe a tree would have come crashing down on us, or we would have had an accident. That's so true. Who knows what could have happened? The way we diminish our awareness is samsara. Awesome analogy. Thank you. You're welcome. Okay. All right. Okay, I'll read a little bit more. Where did I get to? Yeah, go ahead. Yes. Yeah.
So you're saying there's 2 different ways that we experience ourselves as suffering. So we have this experience where we identify that we are suffering, or we identify separate from the suffering's happening to us. So there's really two different ways that suffering's happening.
Say that again, sorry. I'm going to have to repeat it to the audience. Yeah.
I see how it seems to me like there's two different ways that we have suffering appears to us.
Yeah.
One is that we are completely identified with the suffering so that we're experiencing it.
I am suffering. Yeah.
And then we have the experience that we're separate from the suffering.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
suffering is happening to
Yeah.
us.
Yeah. So yes, this is a sort of more of a, yeah, it's to sum up. Yes. Yeah, that's accurate. We could say, I am suffering. And we could also say, I have suffering.
Is there any more ways? Is that two different?
Are we limited to those two possibilities? Well, we could say both. I am both the suffering, and
Yes and no.
and we could say I have neither the possessor or the suffering itself. Yes. There's various ways to go around it, but at the end of the day, the point really that's being made here is that our attribution and identification with self is the problem. And that's where we'd want to question that. And this is good because this is on one way, this sounds very cerebral and analytical, but that's because it's only really on the basis of hard analysis that we take things to be true. And we still, within the Western tradition, we have such vagueness around it. There's so much vagueness around the whole issue of self. And as much as the Western scientific tradition is incredibly, you could say, insistent on hard science, when it comes to consciousness, it vagues out. And that's been since the time of you could say, essentially the battle between Greek rationality and, Abrahamic religions, where the church was seen to own the soul and the science was seen to own everything that was mechanical. And so you had this conflict where finally the mechanistic view won, and then the whole thing about soul, consciousness, mind is sort of just viewed as something that, we don't want to go there. Yeah. But we need to do this, and that's where this kind of rational approach is. I'm not even sure it's particularly fashionable here in the Shire, I think there's a notion that you'd rather just sit and dig the love and the sort of the light, and you don't want to have something analytical. But it's actually, at the end of the day, we're very, you can say, reliant on hard analysis. And it's not as if we don't have, you could say, an intuitive case, because again, we all have a sense that there's a big difference between we have a flat tire and then throw a tanty, and when we have the flat tire and actually just go about things in a very practical way. And we throw a tanty because we're not rested, we're hungry, we're stressed, right? So we're not functioning properly. When we are functioning properly, well, then we just deal with it. So and as a result also, then finally we get the tire changes after having thrown a tanty, called the NRMA, and been breaking down in sobs and whatnot. And then we're haggard. Then wherever we had to go, we arrive haggard. But if we sort of deal with it, then it's interesting. Even challenges, we actually feel almost sometimes lifted if we could meet challenges with sanity, right? So there's a very intuitive component of this argument as well. But the problem is sometimes there's no self. It gets very much seen as a sort of a mystical thing. So in one way, it's good that we do this, to have this discussion.
What comes out when the self doesn't have an audience.
That's right. That's right. If you don't have an audience, that's right. You're way more saner, right? Okay. In the phenomenological tradition, the theorists talk about a bodily intelligence which goes beyond cognitive thinking, unsettling the materialistic, positivistic perspective where cognition and intelligence rest solely on the brain and its functions. Thanks for today. Yeah, that's right. Well, that's where you have a little bit to the two camps of psychology and then neurology, if you like. And that's where the Yeah, that's where there's a challenge between, yeah, the phenomenologists and then those who subscribe to the cognitive tradition. Yeah. But anyway, we're good. We can draw on all of these various views because we're very much constituted by these discussions. So that's where we need to. That's where the Khenpo is extraordinary, because he's actually going into the very place where we talk about these things, and he seems to be, like I said, thanks to his students, really, he seems to be very onto it, both the psychological and the sort of the positivistic approach. Yeah. Jakob, can you please repeat questions from your live people? It's hard to hear. I'm sorry. I'll do my best. Yeah. Tell the mustard seed story. What? Okay. Or there is suffering. Oh, okay. Yeah, we don't want you to suffer out there. Apologies to the. Okay. You should try living in Greece, where all molehills are made into huge drama mountains. Oh, we have them too here. Don't worry. We, the Australians are capable of it as well. We have a saying, don't drown in a teaspoon of water. Yeah, we say storm in a cup of tea, I think, yeah. Depends. Sometimes we are functioning perfect to our causes and conditions. Easier to understand people's tantrums then. I mean, the thing is, one good thing about suffering is then we have empathy for others. So there's always a good side to our suffering, you know. We have our hearts goes out to people with flat tires once we've sort of been stressed by the flat tire situation. We are a gathering of circumstances, of parts, limbs, organs, just an instrument to give a chance to all-pervading mind to express itself. Still, it's difficult not to feel personal about the phenomenon of self. Definitely, definitely. And then, but what is interesting here is what we're talking about is liberation. And the thing is, this personal dimension, it's not as if we would just be, at the end of the day, the sum of all our parts. We are very much colorful, interesting, quirky, original personalities. But that particularly is what actually is the issue here. That is, we're actually not able to properly express ourselves. And that's where you could say the sage actually has tremendous personality. And this is, again, you meet the Dalai Lama, it's not as if he's just some sort of like robot regurgitating Buddhist truths. There's a lot of, personality there. And we all have that. The days when we're relaxed and easygoing, we're far more vivid. We're far more participating in our life and much more at ease with ourselves. So yes, but thank you. All right. Let's see here. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Thank you. We'll just take a few minutes break, and then we'll be back. Okay. So just to say a few things about the practice of meditation. Yeah, like we come across these things like we were just looking at before, where the sort of the instinctive experience of self is so strong that if someone says, begin to analyze if there is a self, it is so tied up with a strong, you could say, emotional sense that, well, you can say what you will, but at the end of the day, there is a self, you know. So that's where we need to go a bit further than just the intellectual dimension. And that's why in the Buddhist teaching, there's meditation. And in some way, everybody knows what it is that we do when we're meditating, because we're really just allowing space, and we're really just allowing ourselves to be the best that we could be. So there's not really anything particularly mystical about meditation. What's mystical about meditation is when it's something that really we engage with as a discipline, because that's where it begins to transform us, but transform us in a good way. So that's where there are dimensions that are associated with meditation, such as miraculous powers, incredible insight, and you could say really a developing of our potential that is unknown unless you actually do it. And so, for example, coming from cultures like most of us do, in which meditation is something unknown, there's also a corresponding history down through the Western tradition, really. And I don't want to particularly be sounding, how do you say, chauvinistic here, because I'm a Westerner too. And I'm brought up as a Westerner and within the modern world and all of that. But I have to humbly admit that there's a conspicuous absence of ability. There's a conspicuous absence of the technology. There's a conspicuous absence of the science that actually knows the value of allowing the mind to settle. And that's where this is reflected in a culture that has always been busy about the externals. And so we have a remarkable culture that has created things like computers and has a great medical tradition and all sorts of things that we wouldn't be without. But at the same time, the most important thing really that affects every single one of us is the subjective dimension of our mind. And so that is something that's undeniably a challenge and something that's worth looking into. And that's where that's where we look at the Buddhist teaching, where you have a lot of interesting perspectives, but they are all really only designed to provoke an insight that then actually has to be deepened in terms of experience. And that's where inevitably we have to meditate. In the Buddhist tradition, everything really is premised on actually gaining experience, to the point even that in the Buddhist tradition, you kind of mock the intellectuals. I mean, the Buddhist tradition actually is strongly intellectual, but really just as seen as, you could say, the foundational aspects of it. And so there's very often that the intellectuals, they're mocked, even within particularly in the Tibetan tradition, where you have tantrikas who are yogis and who actually live, you could say, insight, but very often in very unconventional ways. Some yogis who are sort of just live in charnel grounds, and yogis who engage with life in a completely different way would have sometimes make thick fun of the intellectuals. And that's where there's a lot of respect for, you could say, hard knowledge, for the reasons that that's where we can say where we gain certainty. But there's also there's an insight that unless we actually translate insight into experience, then just insight, knowledge, and so on doesn't really amount to much. And so that's where in the Buddhist tradition, universally, wherever we go, there is this practice of shamatha and vipassana. And all of you here are familiar with these terms, undoubtedly. But just to sort of go over these terms very briefly, they are the practice of providing a structure in which we have physical peace, And that's not necessarily easy for modern people who are very fidgety. We're very busy. And even where I come from, Northern Europe, then you famously have, you know, the idea of the Protestant work ethic, which is, you know, really the value of your life is proportional to what you do. And especially if you're a hard worker, then you're a respectable person. And so the component of sitting still is not necessarily that easy, and it's certainly not something indulgent. To actually sit and meditate is anything from indulgent, because we are restless. So to actually engage in sitting and meditating is actually praiseworthy, and we are, you could say, quite proactive in doing something like that. But it does provide a physical framework of peace. So it enables us to really ground ourselves in our physicality and connect ourselves with the body, feel our body, because as we know, we go through most of the day disconnected from really our body. We're thinking about things, we're on our way here, on our way there, busy with this, that, and the other. And to actually connect with being properly present really goes through the body. And that's where we begin to have some sense of peace on the basis of just sitting quietly. Especially for the modern person, very difficult, because we are continually programmed to be entertained with all sorts of, there's hardly a moment when we are not, you know, on our devices or engaged in one way or another. Anyway, that physical dimension of peace is the first part of shamatha, and the second part has to do with directing the mind to being properly present, because we're ordinarily just tagging along with our thoughts. And again, to not engage with our thoughts, again, is something that's almost unheard of. You know, we have this idea, this notion that we have from the likes of Descartes, who would say, you know, I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. And so we think that we really are our thoughts. And that's actually where we need to step back a bit and actually say, am I, and that's the discussion we've had earlier, but also in terms of experience, not just to sort of intellectually analyze it, but actually just experience that we have thoughts. And, you know, good old René Descartes, he was right, he had thoughts, but to actually conclude that I exist on the basis of that, that's actually, from a Buddhist point of view, that doesn't really amount to anything particularly impressive, you know. That's just saying I have a lot of thoughts. I think, therefore, I have a lot of thoughts. Basta. You know, there's not really much beyond that. So you can attribute the experience, you can infer an experience, for sure. But try and notice that those thoughts are changing all the time. And so that would mean you're as many persons as your thoughts. So anyway, the cognitive quality is definitely, and this we also were talking about before, this awake aware quality. Yes, we have that, but it's hijacked by our distraction, by our thinking. And that's where in meditation we come back to being aware, being awake, but not conceptually. It's non-conceptual. And that doesn't mean all of a sudden we have no thoughts. We sit down, we sort of go into a space in which there's no thoughts. That's not going to happen. But what will happen is that we can be present, connected to being present, and thoughts arise, and we don't necessarily just tag along with them. Here comes this thought. I really like this thought. I feel good with this thought. Or here comes this thought. I dread this thought. And let me be distracted by something. Let me watch a movie, or let me read a book, or let me talk to somebody. But actually, what we are doing with meditation is actually being comfortable with the space in which this all unfolds. And that's where we could make a very important insight, which is that we can be perfectly aware, perfectly present, without necessarily that being completely held by the thinking. So that's where meditation is extremely important. And that's where the practice of shamatha is a place where we begin to actually be present. And at the same time, the thoughts, yeah, they're there, but they're not necessarily, they don't have that, you could say, dominance. They don't have that controlling, authoritative power over us. And that's where it's rather important that we meditate, because that's where we begin to get out of our heads. We begin to get out of our ordinary, you know, rather repetitive storylines. So that's where this quality of shamatha is important. And on the basis of that, then also there's an emerging of freedom from the thoughts, which is where we are heading when we approach the analysis we looked at before with vipassana, which is where we see that in fact there's a lot of assumptions that are not necessarily grounded in any reality, and that's where we could see actually this drama around me and the whole reactive patterns that are generated on the basis of this me. Do I really need to do that? And that's where we could actually, on the basis of shamatha, begin to be a little bit sort of like, okay, my angle in everything, my interpretation of everything, it doesn't necessarily have to amount to the world. It doesn't have my view on things. It's just my view on things, and there's something beyond that. And that's where vipassana really means wider perspective. We begin to have a sense of humor. We begin to have an aerial perspective on ourselves. And that's where we become less centered around the self and more participating in the world around us. And that's where the qualities of compassion, they're naturally there. You could say character of vipassana, of course, is on one hand that there's less confusion, but the character is also the warmth and the awareness of other, the interest in other. We begin to break out of this sort of self-imposed bubble and become more aware of something greater. So that's where shamatha and vipassana is very, very helpful. Now, one more thing that we do in the Buddhist tradition is with the awareness that there's a dimension of something that is greater than just ourselves and our sort of familiar version of reality. There's very much an invoking of the greater. And we don't do that in the form of invoking God, even though from a Buddhist point of view, the whole idea of God is not as evil as it is in some of the, you could say, the social analysis we could have of how religions, they sort of play out. But the issue is more that we have an actual, what we could call phenomenology, or we have an actual experience that lies beyond self. And this we can appreciate when we meet great teachers. So in the Buddhist tradition, there's a lot of veneration of teachers. And it's not idolatry. It's not like just people's sycophantic sort of adoration for some cosmic parental figures or whatever. It's more just that there's someone who got it. There's someone who's sane. And keeping that sanity, you could say, in front of us is very helpful. So there's a big difference between if you're sitting there thinking about politicians that you hate and then thinking about the Dalai Lama or the Buddha, because you're keeping the memory of the Dalai Lama present in your mind. That actually lifts you. We might be habitually sort of gravitate towards things that make us depressed. So we might think about all the people that we hate and all the politicians that we sort of habitually like to sort of whinge on about. And of course, that brings us down. So that's where we can kind of choose the company that we keep. But certainly when we sit down and meditate, we very often preface that with something that lifts us. So like I often say, in some traditions, you have the reading of scriptures to begin with. Here we practice this Buddha sadhana that invokes the Buddha. And that's really from the point of view of connecting with the embodiment of awakening as it exists. But the fact that we attribute enlightenment to the Buddha doesn't necessarily mean that we're just externalizing the Buddha and turning the Buddha into some sort of parental savior figure. It's just like I said, if we think of the Buddha, that actually affects our mind. And so that's where thinking of the Buddha is something that's very helpful. It's not about seeking to get away from ourselves. It's actually beginning to connect with what we truly are. Because if we didn't have the Dalai Lama inside, or if we didn't have sanity inside us, we couldn't recognize sanity in other people. And if it wasn't that we had this, you could say, Buddha nature, we wouldn't recognize the value of what the Buddha represents. So in that sense, we invoke the Buddha, but not as someone external. We very much invoke the Buddha as embodying the awakened condition. And that's something that, of course, in the Vajrayana, there's a lot of that, because we invoke the you could say, the qualities of enlightenment in the form of deity and in the form of the yoga of deity. But that never really amounts to more than just cultivating the potential that we have. And so similarly, also invoking the form of the Buddha is really just cultivating the potential that we possess. But the language also, I should say, and I always want to do this because this is not supposed to be some sort of exclusive sort of Buddhist event, really, that I always like to think anybody should be able to come here and participate. But the language that we have in the Buddha sadhana is very bhakti. It's very devotional. And so that's where, if we come from a culture, you could say a very egalitarian, democratic-minded culture and so on, in which there's no tall poppies and nobody's anything special, then the sort of the idea and the sort of the unreserved adoration that the liturgy here reflects might come sort of rub us the wrong way. But so that's where it's just important to appreciate really why there is such a language of bhakti, and that is because there is this completely unreserved appreciation for the Buddha. And of course, it comes from a culture in which this was recognized. For us, Buddhism and the whole language around enlightenment is something that's, at best, it's something that's fairly new to us, or it might be something entirely alien. But even myself, who's been a Buddhist for a while, I'm completely aware of how the language of bhakti and devotion and so on is difficult for the modern person to handle. But at the same time, this is not going to make me sort of want to cancel it out. For years, actually, I did these, like I'm doing these Mondays, without doing this practice, just because I thought it would be too difficult for, many people to handle. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to come out of the closet. And I am a great fan of the Buddha. And I think thinking of the Buddha is really valuable, really helpful. Just like I would say thinking of the Dalai Lama is really helpful. And if you're sitting here with me, we have lots of pictures of our teachers on the wall. And there is definitely a culture of humble recognition of the greatness of these persons. But they never amount to saviors. It always, unfortunately, and this is, of course, annoyingly, because if we were hoping for a savior, then also we get disappointed, which is that they really just represent persons that are there as teachers, as mirrors. And so there's a vast difference between having someone who's there actually saying, I can't save you, you're going to have to do it yourself, and then having somebody who says, oh yeah, just subscribe to me and I'll beam you up, Scotty. That's very different. So the format of invoking the Buddha, and also the format of devotion as we have it in the Buddhist teaching, might be new to us in the modern era, but at the same time, we'd sort of be a very impoverished culture if we didn't begin to sort of just go a little bit outside our sort of little village and actually begin to appreciate some of the wisdom that exists elsewhere. And so I've decided to sort of incorporate this in the Monday sittings. Sol, you remember back in the day when we would just go in, I just would chant the Yidama mantra, right? And then we just go straight into sitting, right? But I think this approach is very valid as well. And especially because so much of the Buddhist teaching, that's actually where we're heading. There's a lot, one thing is to just have the sort of the idea of Buddhism as mindfulness, but there's a lot more to it. And we'd miss out hugely if we sort of, if we try to diminish Buddhism to fit into the sort of cultural parameters of that we're familiar with. Okay, enough said. So again, we'll take a few minutes break. I'll just see if there's any questions here, and then we'll begin. So someone says, it is not that sages let mind express itself instead of their personal sense of self. Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, essentially what the sage does is the sage frees that which was repressed. So yes. Can you say that again about sages being mirrors? Could you elaborate? Well, okay, yeah. The Buddha and all the various teachers from the time of the Buddha, they were exactly that, teachers. So not saviors, but really just persons that mirror our potential. And as such, also they're there with us in terms of mirroring our shortcomings, but also mirroring our potential. So when we look at a sage and we think wonderful about that sage, it's because we have that potential within ourselves. So in that sense, very often we actually sort of in our self-deprecation or low self-esteem and so on, we think, no, I don't possess any qualities. And yet we're able to recognize it in great persons. So that shows that if we didn't have that potential inside, we wouldn't be able to recognize it. So in that sense, mirrors. Yeah. Okay.
That can be really helpful, I think.
Okay. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. Ah, as the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence, magically there appears before me in the sky amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel-lined throne and lotus sun and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks, clad in the 3 Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture. His right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 close suns, 16 elders, and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircles him all around. Simply think of him, and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the two extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues of body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings, accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teachings ceaselessly and in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, I'm accumulating now and will accumulate in the future. For the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the three jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Te yata muni muni maha munaya soha. 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 Om 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 muni muni maha munaya soha. Muni muni maha munaya soha. Om muni muni maha munaya soha. Muni muni maha munaya soha. Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to arise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. The miraculous display of the unsurpassable wisdom appears as the intentions, deeds, prayers, knowledge, love, and ability of all the Sugatas and their children. May all beings become exactly like them. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhicitta, which counteracts birth in all dual realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas. May I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels in all the direction of the worlds in the 10 directions to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those supreme among humans to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away, and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dhammadhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings nor life force. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of a self. May I realize the Dhammatha where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping onto a self and mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity, free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity. Endowed with a flawless ethics that is guided by rules and an ethics that is completely pure. With an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas do not remain caught by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's stride, and through the samadhi that is like a vajra, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, nature of the 3 times, and the 3 types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in a bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya and the kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world, may the light of the teaching shine like the sun. May the holders of the teaching live in harmony. and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya stiti yavat yavatcha jagatah stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadugani nignata. Akashasya stiti yavat yavacha jagatah stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadugani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadugani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadugani nignata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Thank you. I think this last this aspiration of from Maitreya, I think it actually comes from, it says from the Ratnakuta Sutra, but I also did find it at one point. I found it in the Avatamsaka Sutra, and I think it might be in that section that we call the stem ornament that Somsa Khenpo Rinpoche was teaching, or the stem array sutra. Yeah, I think we might actually find it in there. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm curious if it's not in there. Anyway, thank you very much, and see you again next week. Ciao.